The wind carried the scent of dry grass, and coming rain the afternoon Nathaniel Cross rode up to the small parsonage at the edge of Miller's Crossing, dismounting slowly from a horse as tired as the man on its back, both of them having covered nearly 200 miles since Nathaniel lost his position on the Rocking J when the outfit was sold off piece by piece to settle the old owner's debts. He'd heard there was work to be found this far north, a widow running her late husband's ranch with more cattle than hands to manage them, and he'd ridden through 3 days of hard weather on nothing but that rumor and the desperate hope that his skill with horses and cattle would count for more out here than the empty pockets he carried into every town. What he hadn't expected, walking up the dirt path toward the small white house beside the church, was to find not the widow he'd been told about, but a young woman standing in the doorway holding a worn Bible against her chest like it was the only solid thing keeping her upright, her pale blue eyes fixing on him with an intensity that made him feel, for one uncomfortable moment, as though she could see clear through every hardship and failure that had brought him to her door. "I'm looking for the Hartwell ranch," Nathaniel said, removing his hat out of old habit, though something about her steady gaze made the gesture feel inadequate. "I heard there might be work here. Ranch hand work. I've got experience with cattle, with breaking horses, whatever needs doing." The woman studied him a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a strange, quiet certainty that unsettled him more than any hostility could have. "My name is Sarah Hartwell. This is my father's ranch, though he passed this spring and left it to me and my mother to manage, and we do need hands, Mr. Cross. Nathaniel Cross. Mr. Cross. But I should tell you plainly, since I believe in plain dealing, that I prayed on this very porch not 3 days ago, asking the Lord for guidance about the ranch, about how my mother and I were meant to keep it running with winter coming and half our hands already gone to better paying outfits further west. And what came to me in that prayer wasn't simply an answer about hired help. It was a conviction, clear as anything I've ever felt, that what this ranch needed wasn't just another set of hands passing through for wages, but a man willing to plant himself here proper, to build something lasting rather than just work a season and move on. Nathaniel stood there in the yard, hat still in his hands, uncertain whether he was being offered a job or turned away entirely, uncertain whether the strange, earnest young woman before him was testing his character or simply thinking aloud in a way that had nothing to do with him specifically. "Ma'am, I don't rightly know what to make of that, but I can tell you I'm not a man who runs off mid-season. I finish what I start. If you've got work here, I'll do it honest and I'll do it well. Whatever else you're praying about is your own business." Something shifted in Sarah's expression then, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even approval, and she stepped back from the doorway to let him see past her into the modest front room of the house. "Then come in out of this wind, Mr. Cross, and we'll talk about wages and work, and you can tell my mother about your experience with the herd. But I'll be honest with you now so there's no confusion between us later. I don't intend to hire a man who's only passing through, because I've watched this ranch bleed good workers all season to places offering better pay and shorter hours, and I won't invest my trust in someone who's already planning his next move before he's unpacked his saddlebags." Nathaniel followed her inside, and though he couldn't have said exactly why, something about her directness, her refusal to soften hard truths with polite evasion, struck him as more honest than any conversation he'd had in months of drifting from one temporary position to the next. Her mother, a thin, careworn woman named Ruth who moved with the particular stiffness of someone recently widowed, appeared from the kitchen and looked him over with the same evaluating gaze her daughter had offered, though hers carried more weariness than conviction. "We can offer 40 a month and board," Ruth said without preamble. "Though I'll tell you straight, Mr. Cross, that's less than the bigger outfits are paying this season, and I understand if that's not enough to interest a capable hand." Nathaniel thought of the 200 miles behind him, the empty pockets, the string of ranches that had turned him away with apologetic shrugs about tightened budgets and no room for new hands, and he thought too, unexpectedly, of the strange certainty in Sarah's voice when she'd spoken about her prayer. A conviction so unlike the careless indifference he'd grown used to from most people he'd worked for. 40 and board will suit me fine, ma'am, so long as there's honest work behind it." The work, as it turned out, was more than honest. It was grueling in the way only a struggling ranch short-handed going into winter could demand, and Nathaniel threw himself into it with a determination that surprised even him, mending fences that had gone neglected through a summer of insufficient labor, working the herd from dawn until the light failed each evening, teaching himself the particular rhythms and needs of land he'd never worked before. Sarah, he came to learn over the following weeks, was no delicate parson's daughter content to remain indoors while the ranch struggled around her. She rode out most mornings to help however she could, competent with a rope and steady in the saddle in ways that spoke of a childhood spent genuinely working alongside her father rather than simply living adjacent to his labor. And Nathaniel found himself watching her with a curiosity that had little to do with the ranch business that justified their daily proximity. She was unlike any woman he'd known, direct in her speech in a way that could have read as harsh from someone with less obvious warmth beneath it, deeply devoted to a faith that clearly wasn't performance but genuine conviction shaping every decision she made, and utterly unafraid of hard physical labor despite the delicate, almost fragile look of her, blonde hair and pale eyes that seemed built for parlors rather than cattle drives. It was nearly a month into his employment, on an evening when an early autumn storm had driven them all indoors earlier than usual, that Nathaniel finally worked up the nerve to ask her about that strange conversation on the porch, the one about prayer and conviction that had haunted him quietly through weeks of exhausting labor. "You said you prayed for guidance about the ranch, and what came to you wasn't just an answer about hired help. What did you mean by that, exactly?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, mending a torn shirt sleeve by lamplight at the kitchen table while her mother dozed in the chair by the fire, and when she finally answered, she didn't look up from her work, as though the honesty required looking somewhere other than directly at him. "I meant that I didn't pray for a ranch hand, Mr. Cross. I prayed for a husband. I'm 23 years old, unmarried, out here in a territory where eligible men are scarce, and my father's death left this ranch too much for my mother and me to manage alone indefinitely. And I asked God plainly, on that porch, to send someone who could be both, a partner in the work and a partner in life, because I didn't believe I had the luxury of waiting for those two things to arrive separately." Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest, equal parts alarm and an emotion he wasn't yet ready to name, and he set down the leather strap he'd been repairing to look at her directly. "And you're telling me this because you believe I'm the answer to that prayer?" "I'm telling you this," Sarah said, finally meeting his eyes with the same steady directness she'd shown him on the very first day, "because I don't believe in games, Mr. Cross, and I'd rather you hear the truth from me plainly than wonder about my intentions or worry I'm angling toward something I haven't the courage to say outright. I don't know if you're the man I prayed for. That's not a decision I make based on a feeling, no matter how strong the conviction felt that day. It's something I've watched unfold over this past month, watching how you work, how you treat my mother, how you handle yourself when things go wrong, whether you're the kind of man who runs from difficulty or stays and sees it through. I still don't have a certain answer, but I wanted you to know what I was thinking, rather than let you wonder why a preacher's daughter kept looking at her new ranch hand with more attention than his cattle work alone would explain." The confession hung in the quiet kitchen between them, and Nathaniel found himself thinking of every ranch that had turned him away, every month of drifting that had left him feeling like a man with no place solid enough to call his own, and he understood, with a clarity that startled him, that he wanted very much to be the answer to whatever question this remarkable, direct young woman had been asking. "I've never had much reason to stay anywhere long," he said slowly, choosing his words with more care than he usually bothered with. "Never had much reason to want to. But this past month, working this land, sitting at your family's table each evening, I've felt something I haven't felt in longer than I care to admit. Something that feels less like passing through and more like arriving somewhere I might actually belong. I can't promise you I'm the answer to a prayer, Sarah. I'm just a man who's made plenty of mistakes and has precious little to offer beyond willing hands and an honest heart. But I can promise you I'm not looking to leave. Not this ranch. And not you, if you'll have patience enough to let me prove that with time rather than words alone." Winter settled hard over the ranch in the weeks that followed, and Nathaniel proved his words through action the way he'd promised, working through blizzards to keep the herd from scattering, sitting up through a long, frightening night when Ruth took ill with fever, riding 2 days through dangerous snow to fetch the doctor from the nearest town without complaint or hesitation, and slowly, steadily, The careful watchfulness in Sarah's eyes gave way to something warmer, something that looked increasingly like the certainty she'd described feeling on that porch months before. By the time spring finally broke and the first green shoots pushed up through ground that had been frozen for what felt like an eternity, Nathaniel found himself walking with Sarah along the creek that bordered the eastern pasture, both of them worn thin from a hard winter's labor but standing straighter for having survived it together, and he stopped there beside the water, turning to face her with a directness he'd learned, in these months beside her, was the only honest way to approach anything that truly mattered. "I came to this ranch looking for wages and a warm place to sleep through winter," he said. "And what I found instead was a woman brave enough to tell a stranger she'd prayed for him before she even knew his name, and a family willing to trust that stranger with everything they had left in this world. I don't have much to offer you, Sarah, not land of my own, not money beyond what this ranch pays me, but I have a heart that's found its home here, with you, and I'm asking you now, plainly, the way you first spoke to me on that porch. Will you marry me?" Sarah's answer came without hesitation, without the careful deliberation she'd shown in every other significant decision he'd watched her make, because this, she told him later, was the one answer she'd already known for months, ever since watching him ride up to her father's ranch with nothing but a tired horse and an honest request for work, before either of them understood that God, in his own quiet way, had already answered a prayer spoken alone on a porch, long before the man meant to fulfill it even knew he was riding toward his own future. They married that spring in the small church beside the parsonage, with Ruth standing proud despite tears streaming freely down her weathered face, and the Hartwell ranch, once teetering on the edge of failure for lack of steady hands and steady hope, flourished in the years that followed under the partnership of a woman brave enough to pray boldly and a man humble enough to answer that prayer with nothing more than honest work and a heart willing to stay.